Hi everyone, welcome to the Learn How to Engage Zero Trust Model with UEBA webinar presented by Optiv and LogRhythm. My name is Lindsay Hedke. I'm a Demand Generation Manager at Optiv and will be your moderator for today. Before we get started, I just want to review some administrative details. As you will notice, there are several widgets on your dashboard. All of these widgets are movable and sizable to whatever you wish. There are a list of additional resources on the right-hand side around UEBA, Optiv, and LogRhythm. Feel free to download those for takeaways. You can also expand and learn more about our speakers under their pictures on the left-hand side. Any questions you may have during the webinar can be submitted through the chat window at the bottom right. I'll go ahead and compile all of your questions and we'll address them at the end with the speakers. Now I'll introduce our speakers for today. Mark Clate is a Principal Security Consultant in Optiv's Architecture and Implementation Solutions practice on the Security Intelligence Solutions team. Mark's role is the SME for LogRhythm, providing implementation support and consulting to Optiv's clients with expertise in the SIEM platforms. Mark has been in the SIEM field for 11 years, working for VARs and MSSPs with a strong background in pre- and post-sales consultative and architectural roles, as well and building out multiple MSSP practices utilizing LogRhythm as their back-end platforms. We also have Greg Foss, who is LogRhythm's Head of Global Security Operations, where he is tasked with leading both offensive and defensive aspects of corporate security. His team drives product research and development from the front lines, consistently focused on improving defensive capabilities. Previously, he was a senior researcher with the lab's threat intelligence team, presenting research at various information security conferences, such as Blue Hat, DerbyCon, Black Hat, AppSec USA, and others. And now I'll kick it over to Mark to get us started. Mark, over to you.
Thank you, Lindsay. What I'd like to do right off the bat is just kind of talk about Optiv and the Architecture Implementation Services team that I'm the principal for. Currently, you're seeing that, the idea of Optiv is we are a vendor agnostic service provider for you as the client. What that allows for is the ability for us as the consultant to come in and be truly consultative to you, look at your entire environment, and give a full holistic view of what you need to have happen, what tools you have in place, and how we can do this. Each one of our consultants have multi-technologies on the back end that they are experts in, and that allows them to have a full view of all the features that the product, in this case LogRhythm, has and how to integrate it within your environment. One of the cool things that I like to kind of point out is on the next slide. Oh, it's not loading. There we go. The animation is loading here. That our consultants, over the year of 2017, we did over 8,000 hours of LogRhythm projects. We have 9 certified deployment consultants within the LogRhythm practice itself, totaling over 40 years of experience with LogRhythm. With that allows for LogRhythm to be Optiv's top SIEM partner in 2017. I don't see that changing in 2018. I just didn't have the numbers handy for that. Again, what this allows for is the ability for Optiv to come in, know your product, know your tools that you have, and make everything work perfect, especially in the UEBA side of things. On that, we'll lead this over to Greg. Greg, it's yours.
All right, thank you, sir. Well, let's go ahead and jump into User Entity and Behavior Analytics, aka UEBA. This is something where, I've being in the industry for quite some time now, UEBA has always kind of been something we did. It's just never really had a name put to it. Tracking what users are performing, what actions within what systems is always something, all security analysts should be asking themselves. So, what we've been doing at LogRhythm is looking for better ways to visualize this data, present this information, and give security analysts a much quicker path to discovery and remediation. So what we'll talk about is going to be just UEBA in general, some of the things that we're going to do with that, and then how you can actually leverage security automation orchestration on top of this to dynamically respond to some of this activity. So talking about traditional detection and response, I mean, we're looking at, there's just tons of issues with just collecting the log data and parsing that and understanding, what's going on there. I mean, general malware detection platforms, not all incidents even involve malware. Today, more of the attacks that we're actually concerned about within our environment are these fileless attacks. People stealing credentials, pivoting, things like that, not really dropping binaries. And a lot of these don't leave a lot of evidence unless you're doing full EDR collection on all of your endpoints and you have very good visibility. You might not see a lot of this activity. Advanced threat actors tend to try and blend in. They don't want to hop on a system and immediately run Nmap and scan your whole environment or something. They're going to blend in and act as an employee, maybe do passive reconnaissance with Active Directory and things. So the more you can do to detect this anomalous changes in behavior, the easier this is going to be for you, especially looking at insider threats. That's something where we actually have a case study dealing with an insider threat that I'll talk about towards the end of this presentation. Operational technologies, some of these very critical devices that control, even in the medical sector, keeping people alive, things that are very pivotal in that sense. And then IOC, threat intel, something where, threat intelligence in general is an interesting kind of approach, right? You're not going to be hit with the same attacks that maybe all these other companies would be hit with. It's really very specific to your industry a lot of the time. So the IOC-based information is great for stopping a lot of the commodity stuff, but if someone stands up their brand new C2 infrastructure and is just targeting you, that's not going to help out too much. And then profiling behaviors based on their peer groups. This gives you insights into how they normally act and differentiate. And focus on the known and stuff that isn't detected by determined attackers. So the real value of UEBA, it cuts across all of this, right? We're focused on the behaviors regardless of what technologies you have in place. We're looking at that end user activity and what people are doing with their day-to-day accounts and how that changes over time. Kind of bridging that gap in existing detection and response capabilities. We're easily integrating this into our existing workflows. This is something where I'll show you kind of how this ties in later in this slide deck, but we can tie all this into everything we have in place already. And this essentially enables more in-depth threat hunting versus a reactive kind of response, which a lot of the industry, especially some of the folks that are understaffed, I mean, a lot of these security teams out there are simply just trying to keep their heads above water. I've definitely been in that boat before as well. And it's tough, right? You have so many day-to-day fires to put out. You don't really have that time to dedicate to the in-depth threat hunting that's necessary to really get to finding resolutions to these. So this really comes down to the difference between scenario and anomaly-based detection. These slides will be made available later, so I don't want to just read through all this, but in general, scenario-based detection, kind of what we've been traditionally doing for years now, is looking at the things we know about. Like we know what SQL injection looks like, we know what cross-site scripting looks like. Those are things that are easily detectable within logs. We can trigger on that activity, we can block it, and there's whole entire tool sets specific to that type of thing. There's the IOC integration systems where we're looking at files across the wire, evaluating hashes and things like that. Looking at those IOCs and the combination of how that activity works, that's another thing that we can use in terms of scenario-based. But anomaly-based is looking at normalizing data over a long period of time. So looking at these known patterns of activity and then baselining that over long periods of time, talking 30-plus days, and then looking for deviations in that. When someone steps outside of that norm, is that something we're going to notice? and how far outside of that norm do they have to go for them to be noticed. And that's something we're working on a lot over on our side, is trying to figure out the best way to elevate that kind of activity, highlight it, bring it to the surface, and present that to analysts so they can dig into the data more and determine if this activity is malicious or not. Kind of giving us those investigative leads and triggers that we'll need to dive into something a bit further. So security automation and orchestration is kind of something that I really view it as the glue that kind of brings a lot of these processes and data together to form an actionable response. So what we've been doing with this, we have a lot of really cool stuff in terms of SAO around UEBA. I think it's pretty cool. First one I want to touch on here is Okta. So Okta is one, we actually just recently switched over to Okta for our multi-factor and SSO integrations across all of our cloud applications. Now, up here what you're looking at is just the LogRhythm dashboard that's presenting this Okta data. And it's pretty cool the amount of information you can find just from how people are authenticating, where they're authenticating from, what types of devices they're using to authenticate, and the frequency of authentications. Something where right away we can identify kind of major issues. Like one of the things up here, we were detecting a brute force attack. It's up in that top right kind of red circle there. And this is where you can see there's one chunk that's a lot larger than all those other kind of chunks of that log data there. So the number of logs for this user was very high. So looking into this, we could tell they were having a brute force on their Office 365 account from China. Just from long tail analysis on the log data and presenting it in a way that was easy for us to interpret, for analysts to kind of see that. And so we could really dive into this in a lot more detail, but I'm going to go ahead and look at some of the alarms we've configured to tie into some of this data that we're collecting with Okta. So this one, we're looking for any account that's locked out. So whenever someone does have like a brute force attack or something like that and their account gets locked out, what we're actually going to do is notify the end user and the security team to let them know, hey, this account's been locked out. The IP address that was trying to log in was from here. It generated X authentication failures, that type of thing. And so, when you have this kind of verbose data like what Okta presents, you can actually make very simple rules like this one. We're just looking for this VMID, this account is locked out. So some of them are very simple, right? This one, similar kind of thing, we're looking for brute force attacks. So not necessarily compromised, but someone's tried, 5 or more times to log into account with different passwords. We're going to trigger on that. So all of this, we're not necessarily going to block the account or anything, especially since we have the multi-factor in place. But this will give us the ability to track this IP address and see if they did successfully gain access to anything or if they've been poking at other systems. This one's kind of interesting. This is for looking at successful authentication, but the push or multi-factor failed. So this is where someone maybe gained access to an account, stole a password or something, but they aren't able to get the multi-factor to work properly, or they aren't able to bypass that. So that's one of the ways we can detect this activity and just fire alarms on that. And then over here, we're looking at this account locked again because I want to tie into just the SAO kind of integration that we're doing with this. So the way LogRhythm automation works in terms of with alarming and response, there are multiple different ways you can configure SmartResponse, which is essentially LogRhythm's automation arm, to respond to these activities. So when an alarm fires, you can have this SmartResponse automatically run. If this is something where you just want to go out and have it pull contextual data about the host that's involved or the user or something like that, you can have that automatically fire. You can also manually initiate a response. You can go ahead and select data from the LogRhythm dashboard, hit run SmartResponse. This will go out and run whatever action you specify. Or you can have this tied to an alarm and then have an approval process which a lot of the alarms, a lot of the automation that we have in place where we're affecting accounts, like if we're going to terminate sessions for someone or log them out of a system or block a IP, we have an approval process to make sure we have the right people involved to make those decisions and understand kind of the impacts of those decisions. The real core of using SmartResponse comes down to PowerShell. Since we're Windows focused, we have a lot of PowerShell SmartResponses out there, but it's not limited to PowerShell. You can use Python, you can drop binaries in there, you can use kind of JavaScript or whatever you're comfortable with to initiate these actions. Just most of the ones that we have out there are going to be PowerShell, but very easy to convert into other languages as well if you're like a Python person or something like that. Now, some of the things you can do with it, like this is an example of the account lockout notification. So this one's pretty simple, right? We just have emails generated. This top one is going to our security operations team. It says, hey, this user has generated numerous failed authentication attempts. Their account's locked out. So we're letting the SOC know right away, along with our desktop support team, that, hey, this account's locked out. Person's probably going to be contacting IT soon. Just be aware of this. And then down below, we have the notification that actually goes to the end user. Because all of a sudden, when your account's locked out in Okta, you just won't be able to access anything. It doesn't really tell you much by design. So this is a way for us to notify them, hey, your account's locked out because we saw this activity. Let's work with you and figure out, what's causing this. Is this someone trying to brute force your account? Is this someone, maybe you have a calendar that's synced and is trying to log in a bunch of times, isn't configured with SSO? Could be a number of things, right? Now, taking this a step further, I wrote this little tool called Invoke Okta, which ties into Okta and performs automated actions actually on the account. So what we can do is query information, list all users that are hosted within Okta. We can list locked users. We can list out deprovisioned users. We can get all of the users' associated app links or what their permissions are. And that's just the kind of discovery investigation part. For actual actions on the user, we can terminate their sessions across all cloud applications that are integrated with Okta. We can suspend their account, which doesn't do anything other than keeps it in a suspended state where they can't do anything with their account. They can't log in. They can't touch any of their cloud apps. It's something we've used a few times to make sure the accounts are adequately protected before we unsuspend, which you can do with the script as well. We can also force reset a password, and we can unlock their account. So if they've been locked out by a brute force or something, we can do that. And now, taking this script, we've pulled this into a LogRhythm SmartResponse, where we can run all these actions directly from the dashboard or tie them to any of those alarms that I've talked about, or even other associated alarms. So you see someone maybe clicked on a phishing link, visited a phishing site, and you see a post request go out, which means they probably submitted credentials. From there, you could go ahead and suspend that account and clear all their sessions to make sure that no one's actually going to gain access. So even if they maybe enter their credentials and they approve the knock request from the attacker. So instead of kind of boring you guys with going through use cases and stuff like that, I figured we'll talk about some stories from our internal security team, some of the stuff that we've seen by using UEBA and security automation. So compromised accounts are always a massive problem. Even with multi-factor, we're finding out that people are still able to get in. There's a bunch of tools out there, like Cred Sniper's a really cool one, written by one of the guys at Black Hills Information Security. But that tool is one that's very, very neat for stealing multi-factor authentication, something where it can trick users into performing authentication against their apps to steal credentials and then simulating the actual submission of the token. So a lot of these we get are these fake O365 phishing pages like you see here. This is just one of our other smart responses that integrates with Screenshot Machine, where we actually just take screenshots of links and pull them back. So this is one we saw recently. Turns out this user, they had fallen for an attack some time ago. This account had been compromised and someone had been reading the contents of their mail. As soon as we forced multi-factor on this user's account, we saw this massive uptick in failed authentications. That's kind of what you see over here, this user impacted from the Okta dashboard that we were looking at before. Drilling into this data, we can see this IP address up here actually is from Nigeria, and so you can see them poking at this account over time. All of this activity, they're just running a brute force on this individual's account. Down here in the URL field, we can see this was against Office 365. So they were trying to attack O365 directly without realizing that this user had been switched over to Okta. So in short, we ended up just blacklisting this IP, and we're able to force a reset on this user account just to be safe. And this is after we cleared sessions and all that kind of stuff, just to make sure there was no possibility that this attacker had gotten in again. And so that's something you can do quickly and easily to detect and respond to that attack, all without really leaving the LogRhythm dashboard. So over here, let's dive into a different kind of case study. So this is an insider threat. This is a fun one. It was an interesting one for sure when we were dealing with it. And this gets more into the UEBA side of things, tracking that user activity and looking at what what's normal and what the deviations are there. So crypto mining. This is something where we're seeing a massive uptick of, especially in offices. There's a lot of rules that we're coming out with now to detect a lot of this activity. Some of the default rules we had before, just looking for people going to known mining sites and using known mining ports and stuff like that, we found people have been figuring out how to get around that by standing up their own server, spoofing DNS, doing all sorts of things to kind of trick the existing kind of static rules. So looking at that behavior change is a good way to detect this. So a lot of this, like a lot of the malware or a lot of the crypto mining binaries and stuff like that, like CC Miner and others, are actually just going to get quarantined by most antivirus. So like over here, you can see all of these binaries are quarantined. So traditionally, as long as you're running relatively good antivirus, most of the stuff can't get installed unless they recompile it, maybe make their own version of the miner or something like that. And also the ports, so none of these miners usually use standard ports. We have seen people stand up their own servers to kind of proxy this traffic through. So this isn't the best way to block it, but by default, if someone's just trying to run a basic miner or something like that, usually it'll just be blocked at your firewall unless you have kind of some open ports there. Now, the thing that we've seen, though, is there's a lot of different ways to do this. You don't have to drop anything on the host. You don't have to have any binaries. You don't have to run scripts to do this. There are a lot of websites that you can just visit, and it will use JavaScript to basically use resources from your CPU to mine for you in the background. And so this is something where we're seeing a lot more now, is people going out to these sites like this one is CoinPot here, just to mine and get kind of, very small amounts of coins from these websites. Because, mining on just a generic laptop or something isn't really going to give you a whole lot unless you do it on, say, a couple 100,000 laptops. Now, that's where we're seeing a lot of malware taking advantage of some of these more, different ways to do in-browser crypto mining. One of the most common that we're seeing is CoinHive. Now, CoinHive is something where another one where you can embed the JavaScript that you're seeing up here into a website. You can make this visible, you can make it hidden, kind of whatever you want. And this is something where basically if you visit this website and you're not blocking this content with like uBlock Origin or something, this could start spinning up and using your CPU to mine for this other person. Now, in a way, I think this is more beneficial than advertisements because you're not actually having that risk of loading malware and stuff like that on your system. You're I think it's a little less invasive, especially if they set the limit pretty low. But that's when it's done in legitimate instances, right? There are other cases where we've seen this, which I'll talk about, where this is done very much illegitimately and overtly tried to be hidden from the people that are being attacked by it. Now, one of the ways you can detect this, like if you're just browsing a website or something, all of a sudden your CPU is going nuts. I mean, first and foremost, you'll see that process at the top of your CPU utilization. But also you can see, like in uBlock Origin here, you can see, okay, we're going out to CoinHive. The other one would be OffMind-D. There's CoinPot, a bunch of other sites that would be hit by this that will automatically be blocked by tools such as this. But you can also detect that activity and kind of see what actually is being run using some of these types of plugins. Now over here's just looking at your processes. So here you can see, of course, our Firefox. We have a miner running. I mean, you should never see your Firefox up this high with this many resources unless you have like, 50 tabs open or something, or if it was Chrome. But but I mean, this could have some consequences to business. You're definitely misusing corporate resources. In some cases, we've had some folks report to us that they've had people bring in entire servers to do mining and just reconvert them within their environment and completely shoot up the energy bill and could damage that hardware too if they let it run kind of out of control like this guy here. So the good thing is all of this is relatively easy to detect, at least the basic stuff, unless people are getting sneaky and setting up their own servers and stuff to subvert general detections. This one we actually found very easily because this was kind of a script kiddie type guy who just started playing around with CoinHive. Notice we didn't have it blocked because we don't like to be too restrictive on our firewalls, but essentially over here, looking up just under the common name within LogRhythm netmon, we can see this activity going out to CoinHive. Now, in general, this looks like just basic activity. And we aren't too worried when we see this because there's a lot of sites that will have these running in the background and stuff. The only time we get suspicious of it is when this becomes an issue where it's persistent and we see this running for long periods of time. So over here is essentially one of those cases. So it all started out, we saw this one user, we'll call him Nick. They were starting to mine on their laptop. Now, we didn't think much of it. They just hit this website. Of course, it fired alarms and stuff. But we were like, whatever, they just hit an ad or something. But this went on for a couple days, just persistent mining going from this computer. And so as we started poking into it more, we saw another computer pop up about a day or so later. We'll call it Bob. Another user in the same department, pretty close physically to Nick. Their computer started calling out. And about the same time, we saw another user, we'll call her Carol, started calling out to CoinHive too. And so these were all persistent connections, something where we were seeing this going on for longer periods of time. And now it started to get interesting after, the very next day we saw a few of the development servers that all of these people in this group have access to started going out to CoinHive as well. Same kind of traffic, persistent connections, things like that. We also saw a device on the Bring Your Own Device network started calling out as well. This is something that was brought into the office, and they actually registered as a guest. So it wasn't something where they registered it under their actual work name, which is against our policy. But it was something where they're trying to hide this other device, but use LogRhythm resources to steadily mine in the background, doing it the funniest way possible. I mean, mining from CoinHive, you're not going to make much, even with all these devices. But then within that same time period, we saw a slew of other devices within that same environment begin to call out to CoinHive. So at this point, we're like, all right, this is interesting. We need to really dive into this. And we'd already been looking at these hosts here for a while, but when we saw this new group pop up, we kind of decided to go start talking to people and figure out more what was going on. So let's take a look at these initial systems first and kind of what we knew about them at the time, and then transpose that to figuring out actually what's happening here. So first system was Nick, started mining via web browser, 24/7, running under their general user account. Now Bob, this was shortly thereafter, this was established via Internet Explorer in headless mode. It's a little different. We found this out using carbon black analysis of the binary on their host. This was running under the local admin account. It's a little different than what was going on with Nick's here. And then Carol, same exact thing as Bob's, right? So this was doing the exact same activity, running in a different way. I mean, this Internet Explorer in headless mode is not something you will normally see on any end user system. So going over to these other servers, see kind of what we know about these dev servers first. All of these were in a specific OU. None of these users should have had access to them, which is kind of interesting, right? They all began beaconing within about a week of the initial systems using a local admin account. So that's kind of key, right? You know, how is this account being used, and why are they able to use that on these hosts? And then this BYOD system is connected to Guest Wireless. There's no authentication. They modified their MAC using a trick to get past our authentication, which has since been fixed. But it was something where they did that in a way to not be registered and not have this device tied to a specific person. So they thought they were trying to be pretty sneaky there. Turned out it didn't work as well as they had planned. But all these other hosts, they had the same characteristics as the other end user systems, and these all began on the same day. So it was kind of interesting. Now, looking at how these actually started, how these processes were being run on these hosts, we pulled up the details behind these, and so this is in a carbon black response here. But what we're looking at is all of this PowerShell activity. And so the PowerShell being run here is actually, pull up one of these, is this big encoded command here. Now, so what this actually does, we took apart this encoded PowerShell here to determine exactly what this is doing. And as you can see, this instantiates a new background hidden Internet Explorer instance that goes out to authmine.com and essentially runs the miner with this key here. And so it just does this passively in the background. So if you run this, you'll see Internet Explorer down there is pegged. So it was running at 100% CPU. And essentially, this is just a hidden process that is just in the background and runs for 24 hours before it self-terminates. And so that's essentially what had been executed on these hosts. So we're like, well, how did this start initially? So we're looking at similarities between these systems. These all had remote desktop, PS remoting, and unrestricted execution policies enabled. Now, these were dev and support boxes, so they were, tweaked outside of our normal constrained boxes. So that's kind of why they had some of these open permissions. But we saw a domain admin account was recently used on these hosts, both to gain access and to execute some of these actions. Now, going over to Cloud AI, we were able to see that the domain admin account that was used during this time frame did show up as our #1 top most anomalous user in this time frame. So it's something where, okay, something's definitely going on here. This account has never touched these other hosts before. It's never been used in this way, but it was there because it's a domain admin. And so it's just kind of interesting to see this bubble up to the surface on Cloud AI at the same time we were really digging into this. So looking at the log data behind it, we can see that authentications to a majority of the affected hosts originated from a single development server. And it was using this domain admin account. So now we just have to determine who was logged into that development server at that time and who was doing these other activities through there. So coming back over here, looking at the logs again, we can see that this user, Nick, turned out to be our bad guy. Of course, he's the first one who started doing this. I think he just figured out what CoinHive was and was trying to make a little extra side income or something. But yeah, remote desktop to dev servers. And then from there, he was using PS remoting to these various other servers and laptops to establish this background IE process. So using that domain admin account. The interesting ones were these guys. So Bob and Carol, he actually had a USB HID device that he'd programmed with this PowerShell script in there. And he actually, when these computers were unlocked, he plugged these in and used his script to essentially automatically kick off his code on those boxes. So, validation of the attacker. The original way we found out how they actually got local admin access, or the domain admin creds, was they submitted a ticket to IT to have them fix his wireless. Turns out he just turned this off and knew it was broken, and he had a little keylogger running when IT worked on the system, just lifted his creds at that time. And then the endpoint logs for those systems he ran the HID scripts on, and our camera angles actually caught him doing this. So the coworkers, when they left their desktop, he went over and ran in and plugged in this USB, spun up his scripts, and then left. So, you know, another reason to lock your desktops when you leave. And then he just continued to access additional systems while we were going through and investigating this and determining who this all was. And of course, we got on camera again him bringing in this personal device as well. So, you know, in general, something where kind of an interesting chain of events here. Definitely highlighted areas that we've known we wanted to lock down in more detail on our side, but also was something where, you know, it's neat to see this actually bubble up on the Cloud AI screen to show, you know, that this activity was actually being detected when this domain admin account was all of a sudden being used out of bounds in a different way than it had been before. Now, the funniest part, when we were going to talk to this guy, he actually was in the process of bringing in another system to try and set up his little LogRhythm mining operation. It was an interesting set of events going on here, but it was something where, you know, we were able to identify and neutralize the threat within about a week or so of this kicking off. So with that, I mean, I think in general, UEBA is a very critical tool to enabling the SOC. It's something where we use those types of tactics every day to understand what's going on, trying to baseline that activity and determine what's normal and what's not. And that security automation orchestration is something that kind of really fills in some of those gaps. It also allows for easy transition of new SecOps personnel. They don't necessarily have to know the background kind of inner workings of how something needs to happen, at least not yet, but something where you can set them up with access to the SIEM and give them a set of processes and procedures to follow, and they can hit the ground running much faster than, say, you know, reading through documentation and trying to figure out how to script and handle a lot of these events on the fly. But essentially, the combination of these two cuts across all aspects of companies' technology and architecture to kind of mesh everything and make it as quick and easy to integrate as possible. So with that, I think we'll open it up to some Q&A.
All right, sounds good. Just a reminder, if you have any questions, go ahead and submit them through the chat function. To kick us off, what is the difference between anomaly-based and scenario-based detection?
Sure. So anomaly-based is really looking at the patterns of looking at what's normal and what's not. So like in the use case we were talking about with the crypto mining, that domain admin account stepping out of bounds of what they've normally been doing with it, being used in different ways over different protocols, touching different systems, is all something that elevates that overall score for that account and kind of raises it up to a point where it's something you might notice it. Something where, really the first step as a security analyst is knowing your network, understanding what's normal, what's not, knowing your network architecture, knowing who has access to what. Kind of all those types of things are very important, but using UEBA on top of that is kind of what really sets it apart and is something that kind of gives you that anomaly-based detection capability. Whereas scenario-based detection, you're looking at using things that you know about, things that are easy to evaluate and track within lists and within rules and stuff like that. The problem with scenario-based is a lot of attackers know exactly how these rules work as well, and so they're not going to play by the same rules. They're going to try and blend in as much as possible. I guess something where when I used to do penetration testing and red teaming, it was always something where, whenever we got in, a lot of times we wouldn't do anything right away. We would just sit there and see if they would detect us and maybe kick us off of their systems. If that didn't happen, then we would start doing our passive analysis and start figuring out, locally looking at the domain and things like that to figure out how we're going to pivot. But I think that's where we're seeing a shift, right? People are still using, like a lot of the scenario-based detection is still very critical. It's just something where we're seeing a shift to the need to use some of this more anomaly type of detection to detect some of the more interesting activity.
Okay, great. What are some of the most critical security automation integrations?
Yeah, I mean, for us, like some of my favorite ones, like we have a carbon black response integration where not only are we pulling all of this really rich data from our endpoints, understanding exactly what processes are doing on each of these hosts, looking at parent process, child process, and all the data in between. But we're also able to do automated response against that from the SIEM. So our SOC is set up in a way that we have separation of duties where some SOC analysts will not have access to carbon black response, but we want them to be able to perform a specific set of actions that when they're performed, they're going to be tracked and documented and auditable. But we wouldn't want them necessarily to have direct access to carbon black response where they can go in and remote into systems and run commands directly or something. But some of the stuff with that, we've been able to, from AIE rules, detect, a compromised host or something like that, and actually just automatically isolate them from the network using the carbon black response, SmartResponse integration with LogRhythm. Another one of my favorites is our Office 365 integration, where we're doing dynamic sandboxing of content, automatic analysis of the data. So looking at regex checks across the body of the mail, looking at API analytics for all of the links, dynamic sandboxing of attachments, and feeding all that data back into the SIEM within the case. So we have that kind of record of what happened, along with automated actions such as going out and quarantining mail, dynamically sinkholing links, and stuff like that.
Okay. And looks like the last question, what version of LogRhythm do you need to be on to use Cloud AI?
Yeah, so Cloud AI, like we are actually using 7.2 with Cloud AI right now, but it's something where going forward they're really pushing for people to get on 7.3 to use it because of the additional detection capabilities that are built into 7.3. Like we've done a lot with modifying the machine data intelligence aspect of LogRhythm, where we have a lot more contextual data points to pivot off of in this release. And that subsequently feeds much better into Cloud AI, giving you a bigger view of everything, highlighting who's doing what in a much cleaner way. Cloud AI, the newest release is pretty neat. It actually has like it ties into Active Directory to pull like user Active Directory screenshots and stuff like that, so you can see who the people are. If you're in, say, a company of like 200 plus and maybe don't know everyone, this kind of helps you put a face to the name and really highlight some of like why their activity is kind of out of bounds.
All right, great. Well, Mark and Greg, thank you so much for your time. Great presentation today. Everybody else who joined us today, thanks for your time. We will have this available on demand, and we'll send that link out after the webinar. Thanks so much. Have a great day.